Stanford University.
So we're going to do this panel. Recode is a site that used to be all things D, so it's a 12-year startup. So, I would do it with Walt Mossberg, and now we're called Recode, and we do our conference and stuff like that, and interviews with lots of different people. And my favorite thing, I just recently interviewed President Obama and then later Hillary Clinton, though not at the same time. But I always like interviewing Silicon Valley people best. And talking about startups and where they came from and their origins. And so I'm going to have each of you introduce yourselves, the year you were here, and then we'll go into talking about sort of the influence of Stanford on you, and also where you think startups are now and what it takes to be successful. And you all have different perspectives as investors and entrepreneurs and different things. So Sam, why don't we start with you?
Hi, I'm Sam Altman. I was Stanford class of '07, but I left in '05. Actually, I just saw my old advisor, Dan Bonet, who reminded me told me that was a bad idea. But no, I really loved it here, and now I miss it and wish we're still here. But I run Y Combinator. We're going to invest in our 1,000th startup this year. We have funded many successful startups out of Stanford and not out of Stanford. Yeah, that's me.
Okay.
I'm Clara Shih. I'm the CEO and founder of Hearsay Social. It's a predictive analytics software company based in San Francisco. I graduated from Stanford in '05 with my undergrad and co-term in CS. And my co-founder, Steve Garrity, who is also my class, he and I met in your compilers class.
Jerry.
I'm Jerry, and
do you have a last name, or you just
I'm
like
Jerry Yang.
Madonna?
I graduated my bachelor's and master's in 1990, so I'm the old person in this panel, other than Kara. And no, that was not meant.
Well
that was
done.
not okay.
But
Never mind.
You're going to regret that one.
Right.
He knows it.
I almost got my PhD here, and I'm hoping one of you faculty will take me back someday and give me a PhD here. That would be great. I was just walking through the back, and one of the fun things is to listen to people talk before you give your panel. And one of the two more notable people in this room were talking to each other. I overheard us say, "Oh, I don't know about these afternoon panels. I'm not sure it's going to be all that interesting." So, hopefully, we can make it interesting for you. What else was I supposed to answer?
I don't know.
Okay, all right.
What's your favorite color? Last but not least.
My name is Ramji Srinivasan. I'm BS in Computer Science class of '03. Came back and have started a company called Counsel, which offers genetic screening for people at different times in their lives. Have the distinction of dropping out of both the MBA and Master's program here at Stanford to start the company. Have incredibly fond memories of the Computer Science Department, and excited to be here.
Great, thank you. So I'm just noticing it's an incredibly diverse panel for computer science, and we'll be talking about diversity issues and things like that because of the recent stuff that's been in the news. But also talk about where startups are right now. But first, I would love to talk about sort of what you thought when you came to school, what you were going to do. You all have different years you were here. Jerry, you were back in the Pleistocene age. But what did you imagine what you were going to do with your career that was different than when you got here? Why don't we start with Jerry? You start.
Wow, senior speaking. I have to be on. When did CS go from the humanities, science to engineering? 85. Yeah. So when I joined the campus in '86, it was just making that transition, and it's really hard to imagine that. And of course I know why, but I think that obviously computer science through that nearly 30 years of being in engineering school, but obviously 50 years as we're celebrating it, has had just an amazing transformation. And partly was, I think, computer science in the late 80s, early 90s when I was here was, there were not a lot of computing, there's not a lot of computer sciencing, it was mostly math and theory. And so I was a double E, and I'm probably not I was very close to being in the CS department, but I was a double E major. And I have always wanted to get a job once I graduated from Stanford and then go and support my family. We came from a fairly poor background. And when I graduated with a master's degree in electrical engineering from Stanford in 1990, I couldn't get a job. And so the market was pretty bad, or I was not an attractive candidate, one or the other. And so I decided to take the PhD quals and stayed on. And I think a big part of obviously my career has been the fact that Stanford is a place where during the bad times you can take on a lot of talent and be either professors or postdocs or students. And in the good times, and we've had a lot of good times in the last 20, 25 years, that we've just seen tremendous entrepreneurship. And I wanted to be an entrepreneur in our old discipline, which is computer-aided design, but my PhD took so long that by the time I was getting my degree, the sort of startup phase for CAD was already done and over with, and that's when Philo and I found the internet.
So you thought you would get a job where, at a big company, or what?
I had 2 job offers, one at Oracle and one at National Semiconductor as sort of sales engineers, and I just couldn't do it. So,
Because? All right. Sam?
Yeah, I wanted to be a Stanford professor.
A professor?
Yeah, that was what I wanted to do. It seemed like such a cool job. I love my professors, and you just get to sort of like work on interesting stuff. And in 2005, like it was still in sort of like the bomb out from the dot-com bust. So startups were like this very uncool thing. No one like wanted to do them. It's such a different environment now. But yeah, it was like people kind of looked at you weird if you wanted to do one. Starting a startup seemed like pretty uncool. Being a professor seemed really cool. Going to work at Apple was my backup plan.
It was your backup plan. What were you going? What was the progression when you left?
So I started working on a project that became the company I started as sort of just like something to build with friends, and never meant for it to be a startup, and it sort of fell into one, and then we heard of this thing that was starting called Y Combinator, and I had followed Paul Graham online for years, so sort of did that, and it was this kind of like gradual thing that sort of like took a life of its own, and until the day that I sort of like sent in the I'm not coming back to school paper, I still wasn't sure what I was going to do.
So what happened to your aspirations of professorship?
Someday it would still be great to do. My current job is very much like being a professor. So running YC, I think mostly what I do is work on interesting problems and advise people. So I sort of ended up there with a detour running a company in between.
Clara?
I read a Business Week cover story about Silicon Valley when I was a senior in high school, and at that moment, I decided that I wanted to come out here and be an engineer. So I came out here. Initially, I was
What was it about? Do you remember?
It was just about venture capital and startups and how people with an idea in a garage were changing the world, and that it was cool to be a geek here, and I'm a huge geek, so I thought that it would make sense for me to come. And over the course of being here, I think I caught the entrepreneurship bug. My last year, I was a Mayfield Fellow, which is an entrepreneurship program. In fact, Jerry and others came to speak at our class, and I still wanted to be an engineer, but I thought, well, maybe at some point I want to be an engineer and start a company. And a few years later, I did.
And did you thought to go to a big company, or was it really just the startup mentality that you?
I worked at startups while I paid for my own way through school, so I got financial aid, but I also worked jobs at startups. In the summers, I interned at Microsoft and Oracle, so I got to see both sides of it, and ultimately, I worked at some pretty big companies before starting my own.
So when I was in high school, coming into college and then leaving, the two most influential things for me were Stanford winning in the Final Four and the real world Hawaii, which I thought that's what college is going to be like. Since I'd slaved away and done math and nerdy stuff, I was like, oh wow, I can actually do cool stuff when I get to college. And then I fell in love with computer science and sort of engineering and math applications and sort of practical engineering applications. 9/11 happened while I was in college, and that also cast a pall. I think Sam mentioned about how during that time period, people were more afraid of joining the startups. So I then reflexively sought prestige and decided that I should go try to save New York and go back to Wall Street or go to Wall Street. So leaving college, I went to Wall Street to try and work on like big data and analytics programs. But coming into college, I was really interested in sort of startups. But during that time period, the bloom came off the rose, and everybody's like, "Oh, the sky is falling, et cetera, et cetera." And only now it's amazing to see the resurgence on campus and how interested people are in startups. In Wall Street, though, after a while, I became sort of disillusioned with the work, and I happened upon Paul Graham's book as well, and was really excited by the idea of coming back to Silicon Valley. So, sort of a circuitous route. But initially, when I came in, I was definitely interested. But I think I decided to go work for a big company after school.
You did to Goldman Sachs, is that right?
Morgan Stanley.
Morgan Stanley, they're the same. One is probably slightly more evil than the other, but I'm not sure which.
No argument there.
What?
I was saying no argument there.
Okay. So when you think about this idea, all of you talked about the idea of Silicon Valley, this mythic conceptual idea of what it is. And Stanford is another sort of mythic thing in the character in that story. Do you think that is still real, or has that changed? Is there a place? Is there importance of being, like this department has put out so many different people who have started big companies, and we'll get to the idea of do you need to go to school? A lot of people don't think that. But does that still exist, this idea of Silicon Valley, and is it still relevant, or is there more of a global thought? Any of you can...
When I was in school, it was very inspiring to hear like the stories of Jerry and Yahoo and the Google founders, et cetera. Like this happened right here in this building, et cetera, et cetera. And it was like third floor was mythologized. Oh, this particular room, somebody had actually started a company here and built it, and that's an enormous company. So there was definitely that mythology was very inspirational. So.
I think it's never been stronger. I mean, there's movies about it, there are TV shows that you're on.
Yeah, but they're making fun of you, just so you know. They're actually actively mocking you.
And that's okay, but...
I love that you take it as a compliment. That's great.
It's a total compliment.
They're talking about us.
It's self-reinforcing too, right? Because we've got this great community here. We can hire employees who have worked at other great companies, where ex-founders then go on to advise and invest in other companies. And there's research being done on campus that gets translated into these companies. So it becomes this virtuous circle, and I think that's why it's so successful, and that's why to this day, as much as other cities around the world try to emulate or to create their own valley, a lot of the best and brightest still come here to start their companies.
So I have a positive and a negative answer to this. I think Silicon Valley, this sort of Silicon Valley monopoly, at least in the US, remains very strong. And as Clara just said, there's the thing that you need for startups more than anything else is density of talent and focus. And, like LA is still a city about entertainment, New York is still a city about finance. And Silicon Valley is still an area about startups. And so, like, the cool thing to do here now is startups, and that's great because there is this sort of density of people that help and these sort of random chance encounters that make startups work, and you have smart people to start companies that you can hire, to invest, to advise, and that does not exist in too many places around the world, although I think China now puts out more new tech market cap than the US. Silicon Valley in the US is still incredibly dominant. We looked at our own data at YC, and like people talk about Silicon Valley versus New York, like Silicon Valley absolutely dominates New York in terms of sort of new net market cap created. It's a shocking difference. LA and Seattle are a little better, but Silicon Valley is still incredibly powerful with a density of talent and a belief that people can do this. And this belief is really important, right? Like most startups die because the ideas are fragile and someone says, well, that's really dumb and there's not a support network for that. So that's magic about Silicon Valley. The negative answer to this, about why there's this sort of Silicon Valley mythology and why things keep going, is there's just not that much else working. If you think about where ambitious young people sort of go to have a big impact on the world, excepting the Stanford CS department, which is great, like academia is pretty broken, finance is pretty broken, politics is pretty broken, entertainment pretty broken. So where do you advise a young ambitious person to go? Like tech is sort of the obvious answer, and there's just not a super clear number two for most people. And so I think that's the negative answer.
Jerry?
I think that and I've been asked this question for 20 years since Yahoo started. I think that Silicon Valley clearly is both a mindset and a place. And I think that the role of a Stanford that plays in the place, preceded me by 20 years or 30 years, and obviously will go on long after. And I think one of the unique things about what Stanford does for the place of Silicon Valley is this idea that Stanford is never comfortable with where it is, and it's always looking, and I think this is true, being on the trustees, we have some perspective on this, being on the board, but I think this is true even to the founding days, where it's always challenging and looking for the uniqueness and challenging the boundaries. And I think it's that mentality that I first learned about at Stanford, and listening to professors and listening to people who have built businesses and come back and talk to students, even when I was a student. It was always sort of this wild, wild west adventure, never be satisfied where things are, that I just thought it was normal, having come to school here. And then obviously I've gone back east, I've gone to Europe, and even parts of Asia, where it's just so easy to default back to, which school you went, or who your parents are, and who did you know, and how. And it's really easy to kind of fall back into sort of complacent thinking, whereas I think Stanford always, relentlessly over decades have challenged itself. And I think that mentality is difficult to sort of say cause and effect, but I think that mentality is now also existing in Silicon Valley. There's never, there's never a day that I go through without hearing about disruption and sort of be the first to cannibalize your own businesses if you can find a way to do it, right? And so I think it's that energy, it's that mentality that probably started with the place, but has become part of the mentality.
What do you imagine would hurt that? What are you worried about when you see that? Because there are challenges from across the world. Obviously, China is a very exciting place where a lot of innovation is happening, and real innovation, not copied innovation that people. Just really fascinating.
Do that one first? Yeah, when I in the mid '90s, if you will, there was this massive exercise that that my wife was a management consultant, and she was doing this project for where the next Silicon Valley was going to be, right? And these are projects that I think has happened every 5 years for the last 30 years. And then for a while it was Route 128, and there was the Silicon Hills, and then there was China, Japan, London, Berlin, name your place. And I think for me, I don't think that the model is unique in Silicon Valley. I just think that Silicon Valley has gone through more cycles of boom and bust, and it's very, we're all fascinated by predictive analytics these days, and I think one of the fun things about predicting, for example, loans or credit worthiness or whatever, is that all these predictive analytic algorithms have not had a bad cycle. So how are you going to predict back cycle if you've never seen one, right? But my belief is that I think Silicon Valley has gone through some busts that there's some residual institutional memory. If nowhere else, it's in my head, right? And so I think that helps strengthen and build a sense of place and a sense of resilience that other places haven't seen. Now, I think over decades and even longer, perhaps, but I do think that it's hard to duplicate what is here. There may be another form of it, or there may be some other version of this, but there are threats to this, Kara, and maybe we'll talk about that, but I think one of the biggest threats is if Silicon Valley is not truly a meritocracy, right? If this notion of diversity that drives the best of the best to come here and everybody has a chance to win the lottery like I did, then you will lose that specialness, and I think that's long-term what everybody worries about.
Sam, you were going to say something?
I think for the first time, this is sort of a different sort of diversity. We're seeing housing prices drive founders away from Silicon Valley. It has gotten so expensive to live here that really good founders that always thought they would be here they just can't make it work. And so, you know, in the early days of a startup, like YC's had to continually up the amount we invest. Even with that, people are now choosing to leave just because they can't afford the price of housing. And I think if that does not change, Silicon Valley will sort of lose its grip as Silicon Valley at some point in the not distant future.
Does that relate to sort of the bubble, the idea, the constant idea of the bubble? I'm not saying there is one or isn't one, but it's that constant idea of things keep going up and up and up.
You know, I tried not to call tops in the market. I think if interest rates are sort of zero or negative, stuff probably does keep going for a while. But if we don't have more housing supply, I think it will continue to be a problem.
Clara, what do you think about what challenges? What do you worry about as this founder here in this startup, or people coming out of these schools? Is there a lack of urgency? Some people feel like the math and science education in this country is falling off so badly that we're going to lose that advantage. Other people feel the ignorance of diversity, you know, the lack of diversity could hurt it. There's all kinds of different things. Sam just introduced housing prices.
Yeah, well, there's certainly challenges on many, many different levels. From a societal perspective, there are questions about will these developments in predictive and in AI, what will that do to jobs and the economy? There's this great book from 2 MIT professors that came out last year called The Second Machine Age, which shows that for the first time, technological progress has decoupled from job creation, which means that effectively software is eating jobs. And will that change course? How do we make sure we adapt education, both higher ed as well as K to 12, to make sure that we're preparing students to either be part of the crowdsourcing system you heard from Michael Bernstein earlier, or to be the ones creating the platforms allowing for these exchanges. And I don't think that that's happening yet because, as you heard from Congressman Liu, that it's slow to adapt. When you have a government-driven bureaucracy like education, it's slow to adapt, and yet these jobs and these realities are happening right in front of us.
You know, it's interesting because Larry Page brought up that idea and sort of was shot down. I mean, he said it because he doesn't have a filter, and he's entirely correct, and sort of backed off of it a little bit, the idea that job creation will not be happening and that there will be a negative impact because of these technologies.
I don't know, I wouldn't go as far, I don't have a crystal ball, I don't know about that, but certainly the types of jobs being created more than ever are highly skilled. And a lot of those highly skilled jobs involve understanding computer science, either as a major or a part of your core curriculum.
I don't have a crystal ball either, but I am happy to say that I am convinced that the job destruction in the next couple of decades is going to be massive. I don't actually think this is a new thing. I think technology has always created and concentrated wealth but destroyed jobs. But like honestly, one of the things that I struggle with, like getting out of the bed every morning, is that like my job is to help people destroy jobs, and that's tough, right? I don't think the right thing is to create fake jobs. I don't think the right thing is to try to stop that. But like the job destruction that we're going to see by software in the next couple of decades, I don't think anyone's prepared for, and you can't talk about it. No one, and when someone like Larry Page tries, you get sort of shot down, and it's very unpopular. But like I'm sure we'll have some version of a basic income, and that's great, and I think we should do that. But that does not solve the problem of like how are billions of people going to replace the meaning they got from work with whatever they're going to fill their time with. And I think this is the number one challenge in front of technology.
So let's talk a little bit about where things are going, what you think is important right now. We're going to have questions from the audience in just a short time, but what are you all looking at as if you were coming out of school right now, with the knowledge you have today, what would you go into right now, including you, Jerry? What would be the job you would take?
Glad you clarified.
Right.
Engineer, right? Yeah. So, I look at healthcare as just insanely backward. There's huge amount of opportunity there. It is like, you had mentioned threats before, and I think, sophisticated regulation is also a threat, or unsophisticated regulation. So well-designed or smart regulation is very useful, but things that are done in a hurly-burly fashion will impede job creation, and it will make Silicon Valley less attractive as well. like, there's no reason that manufacturing really should be outside the US, but it's been taxed out. So, like, one of the things that we think about is, like, healthcare is really an information science. Like, clinicians need to make decisions, patients need to make decisions, and I think everybody kind of comes up at the precipice of healthcare and they're like, God, this thing is a mess. I don't want to spend any time on it. But, like, if you push a little bit through, I think there could be really great breakthroughs on the other side, particularly with the rise of, like, things like electronic medical records, which I think are pretty exciting.
I agree. I think whether it's healthcare or education or government, what I would do if I were graduating today is to think more broadly. And that's why I'm so excited about the new CS plus X majors that they have here. For me, when I was at Stanford, one of the first classes that I took as an undergrad was a class co-taught by Eric Roberts and Ramon Saldivar called The Two Cultures, and talking about how techies and fuzzies not only can get along, but actually can be additive and create together. And I think it was life-changing for me. And students that have that perspective, unlike 20 years ago where a lot of computing was about creating the layers of semiconductors or creating the layers of infrastructure for the internet, today there's a lot that we can do that's not technology for technologists, but technology for the masses and technology for all kinds of industries.
Jerry, what would you be?
A
journalist, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think the longer I've been out of school, the more I wish I'd gone back to school, and I think there is this there's a program here that I think Phil Pizzo's doing to get all the old people back to school. But I think the idea of and the thing that I really want to learn is I wish I was smarter in biology. I wish I was smarter in chemistry. I was actually smart in physics. I mean, the way physics is taught now versus when I learned it is completely different. So, so it's a long way of saying that I'd love to get back to some of the fundamentals, and then and seeing where the world have some of the biggest challenges. And none of these are surprising, but how do you plan for the planet to have 10 billion people? And how do we solve some of that problem, whether it's food or security or water? A lot of these things can have a technology component to the solution, although not all of it. And so, now I think I have at least mentally a lot more of a plan if I were re-entering that phase of my life again. But if the only thing I can remember from when I graduated school and even when we started Yahoo was just chaos, right? It was like, I don't know what I want to do, and I don't really, I got time, and time is my friend, and so it's just it's part of life, I guess. But I do think that when I talk to students and talk to people, really emphasize how the opportunities and the challenges around the world are immense, and the opportunities are probably one of the best ever. I mean, people keep talking about the golden era, and I think the golden era of innovation, of entrepreneurship is still ahead of us.
I mean, there is a sense that sometimes a lot of the past companies have been created, sort of big minds creating small things, rather than
small minds creating big things.
How about big minds creating big things? That's where I'm going for.
In retrospect, and I never would have known this at the time, the most important classes I took at Stanford were not the CS classes, but they were as Jerry was saying, the physics and the bio and the chemistry classes. And I think the investments that YC has made that will turn out to matter the most are at the intersections of those things in computer science. So I'm really, really glad I did that kind of by accident. If I had to go into a field sort of graduating today, I would probably I pick machine learning, synthetic bio, or energy generation.
Energy generation in that another big issue.
I mean, we have funded 3 nuclear energy companies now at YC, and I'm confident that at least one will work. Hopefully, several of them. It's kind of cool and kind of crazy that startups are the ones doing this now. But if tech startups are the ones to get fusion working commercially, that's going to be really great for everybody.
Have you done a lot of investments in food technology?
We have. Farmlogs is a company that we invested in that, if they can increase the productivity of farms by 50% around the world, that's pretty changing. Number of water companies. Soylent was a food company that we sort of get made fun of for. But yeah, we've done a lot.
Have you heard of this company, Impossible?
No.
makes hamburgers made of plants that taste like hamburgers.
I'm a vegetarian. I'll check that out.
It doesn't taste like that thing in the organic food store that really doesn't taste like a hamburger.
Okay.
It looks like it. Yeah, it's really interesting. Some of that area to me is super interesting. I find that whole area interesting. But none of you mentioned a water drought company, which would be nice right about now in California. Let's talk a little bit about, and then we'll get to questions, this issue. You mentioned, you touched on this issue of diversity, and I think Marissa talked about it this morning. And I didn't read everything that she had said, but it was about a meritocracy and the idea of computer science being essentially a meritocracy. Do you, with all this, the Ellen Pao trials, the discussion about it, do you think any of it matters at all, or are people just going to go on right through, nod their head, and then move on? Do you think it is an important issue, each of you, and not in a PC? Yes, of course, we should have a diverse Benetton world. That would be nice. But in real terms, is it something that people care about here and should care about? Why don't we start?
I think it's critically important. I mean, about 50% of we work on a lot of women's health applications like prenatal screening and breast cancer screening, so we have a disproportionate number of female engineers. But I think it's really important also to consider all types of diversity, including thought diversity as well. So it forced us, and just seeing all the news about this, just to constantly critically evaluate what our assumptions are. Having grown up as a victim, or not victim, but like having received racial bias growing up, I'm very, very cognizant of how it affects somebody in the workplace. So I think it's something that we constantly need to be on self-awareness for.
Do you actually think something's going to change because of this discussion recently?
Structurally, it's tough. I think we could do a couple of things better. One is, I saw the diversity workplace reports that all the major companies put out, so those are good.
Well, no, not really, but yes, I guess that they put them out.
Good steps, right, in the right direction. But then, are there, in terms of true blinded things, Top Coder used to have this coding competition for engineers, and that couldn't tell if you're, white, Asian, black, or Indian, or what have you. So those things become inherently blind to your underlying characteristics, and then could be more meritocratic ways of interviewing somebody. So that might be an interesting thing, but at some point you still need to meet somebody. So then you run into whatever hidden biases one might have.
Right.
So I don't have a pat answer.
Yeah, there's things that happen. I was interviewing Ben Horowitz this morning, and we talked about this. And he said there's things that happen in the light and things that happen in the dark, and it's the things that happen in the dark that create this situation.
Yeah.
But anyway.
The flip side to that is talent is so hard to get by today that if you're missing out on smart people because you're discriminating in some sense, then you're losing in the marketplace. So,
Clara?
It's incredibly important. I mean, Marissa said this morning her experience was that she didn't feel different when she was going through, and that engineering is a meritocracy. For me, it was very different. I actually felt extremely different when I was going through the CS program here. And if it weren't for great women section leaders like Lily Irani and Marissa, and women that I saw in the early undergrad classes and then throughout the advanced graduate courses on faculty, I think that, it would have been very different. I think seeing them in those roles, whether or not I had a direct relationship with them, gave me confidence and gave me a path to press on. And in retrospect, I found that those classes that I felt the imposter syndrome in, where I felt like I didn't belong, actually everyone thought those classes were hard, not just me. And I think that it's really important. And not only is it the right thing to do, actually at the GSB, Maggie Neal, who's a professor there, has done research showing that in organizations, having diverse teams at the executive team level across the organization, and as well as on the boards, is so correlated with higher outcomes that it seems to suggest causation.
Yes, and yet it doesn't change.
Well, I think in the last few years, we saw the numbers earlier from Miran showing both the absolute number of CS majors at Stanford as well as the proportion that are women. We're making slow but good progress, and I think the recent dialogue that Sheryl Sandberg's book has sparked, whether you agree or disagree with various aspects of the book, that has been an important dialogue for all of us to have, both and especially within Silicon Valley as well as more broadly.
Jerry?
I feel like directionally we're moving in the right place, and some of this is, over a long period of of having been around in the Valley, and this includes my own experience as Asian American, where in the 80s people were talking about, Asian Americans were always just going to be engineers. You got to break the ceiling, and I think while directionally we're trending in the right direction, there's a very good argument to make whether we're making enough progress fast enough. And I think it's the same is true for gender issues. And I was talking to a woman who is in the venture business. She's older now and she does mostly service work, but she was coaching her son, who's a CTO at a startup company, and she said something to me on the phone yesterday that kind of just made sense. She says, look, we as a Valley don't need to go out of our way to do the wrong thing because everybody has to compete in your startup and you need to kind of find the best people. But if you're recruiting people or if you're looking for people, have your recruiter, surface at least one male option, one female option. And you can still pick the best person, but the idea is to just surface as many diverse candidates as you can, whatever the diversity is. And I look around the Valley, obviously I think there are underrepresentation when it comes to certain minority groups, underrepresentation in females at certain places. And I think even at Stanford, the faculty, we can do a much better job in trying to get the next set of professors and faculty to be more diverse. And so I think there's a lot of work to do, but I do think that the mentality is driven not by, well, I'll flip it. I think the necessity drives the fact that we all need to go and be great. And if we can figure out how literally half the workforce are going to be women, and they're just going to be terrific candidates, then it really doesn't matter. And I think maybe what Marissa said earlier, and certainly my own experience, is that when you are in the middle of creating something great, when you're in a rush, when you're in the company that's building one of the greatest things, or feel like you're all aligned behind the mission, you really don't, the gender and the race and the ethnicity issues never even come to mind, because you're just working with people that's going to create the coolest thing. And I think that's what's pure, and hopefully that overcomes a lot of the other biases that we see.
Always somewhat hard to answer this with any credibility as the white guy on the panel, but I will try. I think it's actually still really bad. I mean, I do think we're making directional progress. But I think like anyone that sort of claims it's a meritocracy has a lot of explaining to do. I think the fastest way to fix this, getting people to sort of get rid of their biases is great, and that takes a long time, and we should do it. What I've noticed is that people tend to hire more people like themselves. So if you want to fund more companies run by women or black people, you need women and black people as venture capitalists. And if you want to make a quick impact,
Because it's such an appealing place after that trial to be, if you're anybody, not a white guy. But
well, we have 4 women in our partnership.
yeah, no, I understand that. It's just, I mean, it paints a picture of
no, it's still not it is not an appealing place to be. Well, hopefully YC is an appealing place to be a partner, but as a whole, I don't think it's great, and I think probably even more true for black people. But I think it goes both ways. Like, women and black entrepreneurs are more likely to apply to YC if they see those people in our partnership, and anecdotally, it's moved the needle quite a bit. However, this is sort of delicate to say, I think the women that we have funded are great. I don't think we lower the bar, and yet I do think they have a harder time than the men raising money, hiring, doing everything else. So I think that the sort of unconscious bias is really strong. I think almost everyone is sort of not overtly sexist, overtly racist, but people just have this ingrained in their minds over years and years. And the way to break that is just to say, we're going to fund more women, we're going to hire more women, we're going to whatever this is. And I think it's but I think it's still really bad. You
do know unconscious bias is my least favorite new Silicon Valley word.
Why?
Suggesting you're in a coma and you can't pay attention to what's in front of you.
Oh, no.
No, I mean, it does. It says, that was an unconscious bias thing to do, which means you're lazy, stupid, or dead. So,
Look, I'm not trying to excuse the behavior. I'm just saying, people aren't saying, it's a black engineer, I'm not going to hire him. Like that, I've never heard of anything like that.
No, I get that. No, of course not, because that's why it's easier to deal with those people, right?
Right.
Because they're idiots. But
right.
You know what I mean? I mean, I think one of the issues is that that's the excuse now. I didn't mean to do it, and there you have it again. And that's all I'm saying. And one of the issues that I notice is that they say if we hire more women, we hire, blacks on the thing. Well, white guys should be able to pick women, and you know what I mean? Everybody should be able to do that.
That's a good point, but I think it gets exponentially harder the longer you wait. Any of you who are starting companies or at startups, if you wait until employee 100 or 200 or 1,000 to hire your first woman engineer, your first minority engineer, that person, most don't want to be the first out of a group that many. If you start early, and it's hard to do that because of on top of everything else you have to think about when you're starting a company, for me, diversity was the last thing on my mind, but I guess it worked out in my case because I'm a woman, I'm a minority. It becomes self-reinforcing. And we have a ton of women, we have a ton of blacks, Hispanics, LGBT community at Hearsay, and I think it's because we started early. And so it just maybe a tip for any of you who are starting to build out your teams.
That's a good tip.
So to echo this point, of all of the advice we've given YC companies about how to deal with this, hire a woman on the engineering team in the first few hires. We've heard again and again that has been the most helpful piece of advice for this.
Okay, I'm going to ask the last question then. If there's any questions, is there a thing for questions? Oh, right there. Last questions. If you could, right now, be in CSGO and invent anything, and don't think of, what would you invent? What would you try to invent? Not what you go into, like I'm going to go into healthcare, but...
Automated food or drink machine, because there's, first when I go to a bar, it's, insane, the waiting time, but then the second part is, food, how much wasted time is spent on food preparation, and if you could restore that time back to people, that would be huge.
Ah, interesting. You're supposed to talk to your friends during that period of time, but okay. All right.
The computer scientist, come
Jerry,
on.
That's true. Fair point.
I said this a few months ago on a different panel, sorry, Clara, and
That's all right.
and I thought it was going to be really dumb when I said it, and I'm still really interested in this, but so I'll say it again and see if I still feel dumb afterwards. But I want to invent like an A/B testing machine for personal decisions. So if I could say, should I offend Kara or should I not offend Kara, and then test it before I make that decision. So maybe Clara could figure out how to do this. But I do think that A/B testing is going to get to a point where it could be totally personalized in real time, and I think that would be pretty
You could
cool.
test each one. That would be kind of cool.
There we go.
For society, I'd probably do something for education or healthcare. For myself, I'd figure out a way to build some sort of sleep device, maybe using TDMA or utility computing, any moment of downtime, it automatically gets sleep somehow.
Oh, okay. I like that. Claire just had a baby, so that's why she's there.
Friendly superhuman AI.
A what?
Friendly superhuman AI. AI that doesn't
AI.
kill us.
But what?
I think I think we're still very far away from this, but at some point in the next decades, smarter than human machine intelligence will be developed, and I think no one yet knows how to make a safety framework for that, and making sure the first one that is developed is human friendly is probably super important.
Okay, great. I would do a time machine so I could go back and convince Jerry to go to Oracle. No. Okay, questions from the audience? Right here?
Yes, the question is for the four of you. What would be the advice you will give to people living outside of Silicon Valley that would like to create, and I know that Silicon Valley is, of course, unique, but to create somehow something similar to stimulate entrepreneurship and maybe startups outside of Silicon Valley?
So I know Jerry's thought about this longer than I have, but
I've thought about everything longer.
yeah, pretty much. Yeah. But there's no substitute by leading by example. For example, Home Depot was started in Atlanta by Bernie Marcus with one other co-founder and a bunch of planks. So they made it happen. It's an insanely impressive business. IKEA was started in Stockholm by a Swedish guy who was broke. So there seems to be this where there's an ingenuity and horsepower. And don't get me wrong, I think Silicon Valley contributes to that culturally a lot. But there's no substitute for leading by example and picking off something for a particular local market. And then in turn accelerates and creates a flywheel. Then, wow, okay, somebody hit it big over here. Maybe we can also generate investment ideas as well.
So you're talking about a company, a significant company starting somewhere.
Yeah, Flipkart, for example, in India, people are now looking in other parts of India for the next Flipkart. And there's no substitute, there's no amount of talking, press, et cetera, that will be a substitute for like a very powerful service.
Yeah, I agree with Sam's earlier comment that the biggest bottleneck would be finding enough talent. So depending on the type of company you're starting, if you're looking for programmers and you need a critical mass, it doesn't have to be the Valley, but it ideally needs to be somewhere where there's other tech companies that you can poach from or great research and technical universities that you could hire from. Because I think everything else, with cloud computing, with access to capital, with Kickstarter and all these crowdfunding models, I think everything else has largely become democratized, and it doesn't really matter where you are.
Sam?
I think you need early stage investors that want to be sort of hands-on, have done this before, will advise and give capital. Density of founders, like it turns out to be pretty important for founders to have peers or colleagues. I think with just those two things you can go a long way. But you need sort of, it's like the network effect is very strong.
Another question? Over there? Back, right here and there, right there. Go ahead, you've got the mic, and then we'll bring this to you.
Hi, my name is Ashmi Chokshi, class of 03. I wanted to follow up on some of the comments about food technology and startups for drought relief, etc. So I guess we hear about a lot of startups that give productivity improvements or make money for businesses, but these days we're not hearing too much about companies that are helping use technology for some of the problems, like mHealth companies or any healthcare or food or anything like that. Is it just because we're not listening on the right channels, or are they just not getting funded? Thank you.
So having started a health company, I actually spent a lot of time thinking about this, which is, I traced it back to 9th grade biology class where people learn about the Golgi apparatus and endoplasmic reticulum, and they're bored to tears. And they're like, man, this thing is not gonna have any practical use. And then or something in biology will only happen 15 years later. And so many engineers and scientists get turned off by that. They're like, well, I can memorize a bunch of stuff, but it won't have any practical application. And so now in our subfield, genomics, the convergence is happening between computer science and medicine. And so an engineer tomorrow can work on clinical applications. But there are a lot of regulatory barriers that don't necessarily exist if you're creating a new application that can be launched on iPhone or Android tomorrow. So I think that mental barrier still exists, and I mean we had to crest it and fight that as well. So I would think of that as a time to value phenomenon, which is how long can you take before you actually see value from something, which I think is still true today in health.
Another issue is media attention is another one. There's just not enough media attention to those issues. I mean, I think about food technology all the time now. I don't know why I've gotten obsessed with, with 10 billion people on the planet, like how they're going to do that, and all the cows. I keep thinking I'm obsessed with too many cows on the planet, but there's too many chickens also, and where it goes. But it does take a level of media attention. But when we write about it, we don't get. I got to tell you, if I write about some dumb photo app, we get tons of traffic and not.
But I do think that, and maybe Sam also has a perspective, I do see more and more startups that are either potentially double bottom line with a social goal and a money-making goal, but also solving some problems that are just basic. So, one of the other food companies is Hampton Creek, which is using plant proteins to replace eggs. The other companies that we recently funded is a company called Reaction, another Stanford grad that's doing housing for disaster relief or for refugees, but sort of an IoT housing that's totally sensor-based and really easy to deploy. We're another Stanford startup called Choose.org. It's doing petitions around the world that's changing people's way of petitioning and getting things done. Change.org, sorry. And then, and so I do think that I do think that you still have a lot of people that are out there to build enterprises and good old standard capitalism, but I think there's plenty of entrepreneurs that also are starting to think of, and I think everything in the health and biomedicine, I mean, we are on the brink of potentially solving curing a lot of cancer. We're on the brink of potentially solving a lot of the neural diseases that has bugged us and plagued us. So I think I don't think those things are mutually exclusive anymore.
You know, we funded in the last couple of years alone dozens of food and water companies, dozens of biotech, dozens of healthcare, dozens of energy companies, and probably pretty much any category you could come up with, and the press doesn't cover them. And I think what Clara just said is right, is that when they do, they just don't get clicks.
Right, except for Soylent, because it's really gross and makes people
I
fart.
don't know why Soylent gets
Right.
clicks, but yeah, the press does love Soylent, and so do the readers. But I think this is entirely a perception problem. I would guess only half of the YC companies are pure software companies, but they dominate what the media wants to cover.
Yeah, absolutely. Last quick question up front, right here, and then
So I think it's all your fault, Clara.
It's all my fault. No, I know it's my fault. I love covering photo apps. It's such a great way to have a meaningful life. Go ahead.
So Andrew Simons, I was class of 03. I'm not American, so I went and worked at a big company on an H-1B visa and left after 3 years. So I'm always curious to see what progress Silicon Valley is making or the country is making when reforming some of that. And I guess as investors, what do you do with folks who don't make it into that H-1B round and are stuck for the year?
We don't elect certain people who are running for office, for sure, but go ahead.
So Andrew, we do such an incredible job of getting smart people to leave the country. It drives me insane. So whatever, you know, we supported the forward U.S. immigration reform movement, and we'd love to do whatever it takes to break down those barriers, because it's insane how many bright PhDs and bright grad students have to leave the country. The thing is, for us as a small company, we don't necessarily have the resources to go in Washington and lobby every single day. So as these movements crop up, we'll join them. But to the extent there are any other ideas, we'd love to hear them.
And I think the efforts that they tried, that Mark Zuckerberg was behind, were kind of cloddish initially. They just didn't, you know, they thought they'd just go in and convince them out of the sheer intelligence of it. You know, but that doesn't work in Washington, does it? I mean, you know, my grandmother used to say, intelligence has its limitations, but stupidity is infinite. And I think that's how I feel about Washington. Anyone else on?
You know, I think probably a third to a half of the founders that we fund are non-American citizens, and it is a constant problem. It has gotten a lot better in the last few years. You know, most founders we fund are now somehow able to stay in the U.S. They can get an O1 through or something. So even though the law has not changed, I think policy has changed somewhat.
All right, now last question. Would each of you go back to school again if you could? Would you?
Yeah.
Yes.
Not me. All right, thank you very much. Thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.